Hello, I'm Sharon Drury, and I live in Marion, Indiana. I have had various leadership experiences, jobs in the church, as well as those were volunteer, of course. But my paid leadership experience has been more with Indiana Wesleyan University, where I was dean, and I also founded Advancing Women's Leadership Mentoring Program, which continues to exist today for both IWU and Taylor University women. I also founded Yokemates back in the 80s when I was a pastor's wife. Uh, it's fun to be a leader and influence others in the same season that you're in, home with children or whatever season of life you're in. That was good. And today I continue to work with spouses, male and female, of pastors through Pastor-Spouse Connection that I run with Amy Lucetti. I know that there are a lot of societal and cultural expectations that sometimes can be challenging. When I worked full-time in high-pressure jobs, especially when I was a dean, it was challenging for me at home because I had changed so much, and then my husband had to learn how to respond to this new woman in his life. And I was learning and growing so much that I had to let his feelings catch up. And so taking my dean hat off when I came home, as well as learning how to have patience for his feelings, was something of a growing experience for me. Nowadays, of course, younger men are more used to women in leading, but we still need to remember to never really embarrass men who may be in pockets of our culture that haven't caught up yet. As I mentioned before, there's various seasons of life that most women go through more than sometimes men do. I think we need to explain that to our significant others and tell them what we're actually experiencing. For me, it was always to have some type of influence on the people that were in the same season of life I was in. That seemed to work best. I did quit college to get married. We married very young, and I put hubby through undergraduate and then Princeton Seminary. And then when I was working full-time, early married, we didn't have kids for 7 years because we agreed that we wanted to get out of our school debt, get that put away with, and I put my entire check on paying off school loans. Then we had our first child, and 5 years later, our second child. I worked part-time at home, everything from starting a 501(c) business to breeding golden retrievers, various things at home, and taking care of my mother-in-law for many years when she lived with us. So I don't regret those years of being at home. I learned a lot and was able to still work a lot in the church as a volunteer. The resources that have helped me develop as a leader are definitely books, people, and, of course, my education. The books that I think were extremely important for me included Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. That's especially good for professional women who are young mothers and have to deal with the boardroom as well as all the pressures of scheduling children and various things going on there with your husband too, as she had. Brene Brown has written a good book called Daring Greatly. And she actually has a definition of leadership that I think is quite good. Anyone who holds himself accountable for finding potential in people and processes. I like that as a leadership definition, but also she has a lot of good advice about just developing your self-image, your vulnerability, being up in front of people. That works well. Another one that has to do with being up in front of people is Making Room for Leadership by Mary Kate Morse. She talks about presence, and I think it's interesting. She doesn't write the book for just women, which Brene Brown's book is more for just women. This is a book she teaches actually in seminary at George Fox University, men and women, of course, for over 20 years. And she has a wonderful presence, even though she's a very tiny, blonde, petite woman. She understands that presence is the visual and visceral effect our bodies have on others. I think women sometimes forget that. We sometimes forget the way we used our bodies to when we were daddy's little darling or the princess of the home or our husband's lover or different types of things that women do coyly to attract others, mostly men, and have some influence that way. That kind of stuff really needs to be thrown out the door when we become women leaders in organizations of both men and women especially. We have a visual and visceral effect on others. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what we look like, but it matters how we handle ourselves in a group. Learning to speak well, even lowering your voice perhaps, as Margaret Thatcher had to learn how to do. She took training lessons on voice tone. Learning how to use our hands properly when we're in front of people, and learning how to run a meeting, I think, are some of the most important things that I learned from that book. 2 other books, Leading and Loving It is a book written specifically for pastors' wives. And what they have found is that some pastors' wives just love being a leader. Others pastors' wives are leaders by default, they call it. And actually, many of us become leaders by default. When other people are looking at us for having influence over their lives, we become a leader, whether we want to be or not. And so seeing it as an opportunity, I think, is a great way to look at it. And that's a real positive book. I love it. The last book I'll mention is Leadership in the Wesleyan Spirit, written by Lovett Weems from Asbury Seminary. He has the concept that's helpful in leadership that's called the third alternative. And that is, rather than compromise where you give over to some things, he talks about the integration of a third alternative. He says Wesleyan spirit is actually a third alternative theologically, and that we can look for the commonality on which to build in our organizations and groups when we lead committees or whatever it might be. Rather than having people so pitted against one another, we can find a third alternative. The people that have been important to me as developing as a leader are mainly my husband and 2 women in my life, 2 mentors. I've known Joanne Lyon since we were early married couple. We've been married 48 years now. But Joanne Lyon has been a friend of Keith and I for many, many years. And she obviously models leadership in a beautiful way. Audrey Hahn is CEO of the non-res side of Indiana Wesleyan University with 12,000 students. So she actually hired me years ago, about 25, 30 years ago, and taught me how to write proposals, how to develop budgets, and things like that are really important in organizational life. But probably the most important influence in my life, person that was influenced in my life, is my husband, because he's a natural-born leader. He comes up with some wonderful ideas that can be codified and put into things like strategetics, phrases like it's hard to lead others further than you've come yourself, the idea of growing yourself in disciplining leadership, self-leadership, actually taking time off to eat some of the bread that you're baking and giving to others all the time. Those are the people that have really influenced me. I also have had an influence of several degrees. I quit college to get married, as I mentioned before, in the 60s, but I'd always still loved to learn, so I kept on going after my kids were in school, full-time especially. I went back and got my bachelor's, and then my master's, and then finally a PhD in my 50s, because I just had opportunities that really needed to have an advanced degree. That's after which I became associate dean and then dean over 10,000 students. So education was extremely important to me, and I learned a lot about leadership, even taught leadership in the doctoral program at IWU for 7 years. One piece of encouragement or challenge that I give to you in closing is, if you find yourself the token woman in a committee or on a board or in some group, and you're asked to speak for half of the human race, like, what do women think of this? I try to avoid those and get caught in that, because instead I usually go to saying, well, my experience has been, or what I've learned has been, and then give my own opinion. Because many times what the men in the room are asking is, what are we forgetting? What are we not aware of? And so having compassion on their ignorance, so to speak, we can say things like, well, don't forget to have longer bathroom breaks in the program, or who's going to take care of childcare? Did you put that in the budget? those kinds of things that we can raise consciousness for. I really like the way that some people have been able to work on their voice tone, be in a boardroom, and help men understand. Sometimes men get real risky when they're with other men. And they say even the financial crash of 07-08 could have been tempered, at least, if not avoided, if more women had been in the boardroom making those decisions. So when you are at the decision table, I think one of the most important things is to have a disciplined tone of voice and to plan ahead, decide ahead what one or two, maybe at the most 3 issues you're going to speak to. Never fall into the trap of being the woman who always just questions things and asks questions that nobody can find an answer to, or they get tired of hearing them. Planning ahead with a proposal written out, paper that you can hand out, because the man with the plans, the man with the power, and that's true for women. Women can really have the power to influence at any level of leadership. I truly believe that. And I'm praying for y'all as you're in this course of study, as you develop as leaders. Go girls.